USvsChina, the economic fallout begins. Donald Trump ran for president in 2016 on his deal-making skills. As the 2020 election approaches, President Trump and his surrogates are emphasizing the biggest deal ever seen, the Phase 1 trade pact with China. The accord requires China to buy $200 billion more American goods by 2021 than in 2017. 6 months after signing, the deal's costs and benefits are becoming obvious. Trump claims that trade wars are good and easy to win, but the Phase 1 trade deal between China and the US and the trade war that preceded it have hurt the American economy without addressing the underlying economic issues. Trade war impacts extend beyond the economy. Trump's prioritization of the trade deal and deprioritization of all other aspects of the relationship allowed China to advance its interests abroad and oppress its people at home, knowing that American responses would be muted by a president unwilling to risk losing the deal. Origins of trade war. Trump often blamed U.S. trade with China and its agreements for the loss of manufacturing jobs and intellectual property during the 2016 presidential campaign. He called China the greatest theft in the history of the world and criticized the $346 billion U.S.-China trade deficit in 2016. He said, "We can't continue to allow China to rape our country." Trump's campaign claimed to cut a better deal with China that helps American businesses and workers compete to improve the U.S.-China trade relationship, capitalizing on his reputation as the ultimate dealmaker. Trump proposed declaring China a currency manipulator, confronting China on intellectual property and forced technology transfer issues, ending China's export subsidies and lax labor and environmental standards, and lowering America's corporate tax rate to make U.S. manufacturing more competitive. Trump directly engaged Beijing to address structural economic policy issues after taking office. 3 months into his presidency, he met with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, agreeing on a 100-day action plan to resolve trade disputes. Next month, China pledged to slightly expand its economy to U.S. enterprises and services in exchange for increased bilateral trade and U.S. acceptance of China's Belt and Road Initiative. After Washington demanded greater concessions from Beijing, follow-up talks failed. The 100 days ended in July 2017 without an agreement, press conference, or joint statement from the inaugural U.S.-China Comprehensive Economic Dialogue meeting, which the Trump administration proclaimed dead 4 months later. The trade war was started by President Trump to force Beijing to change its economic system, to stop forced technology transfer, limited market access, intellectual property theft, and state-owned enterprise subsidies. Trump said that unilateral tariffs will reduce the U.S.-China trade deficit and attract manufacturing jobs. The U.S. announced tariffs on about $550 billion of Chinese goods between July 2018 and August 2019, while China countered with duties on over $185 billion. Trade war economic costs. The trade war hurt both sides and diverted trade away from China and the U.S. According to Heather Long at The Washington Post, U.S. economic growth slowed, business investment froze, and companies hired fewer people. Many farmers nationwide went bankrupt, while manufacturing and freight transportation hit lows not seen since the last crisis. Trump implemented one of the largest tax increases in years. In September 2019, Moody's Analytics estimated that the trade war had cost the U.S. economy about 300,000 jobs and 0.3% of real GDP. Others estimate the damage to U.S. GDP at 0.7%. Bloomberg Economics estimated in 2019 that the trade war would cost the U.S. economy $316 billion by 2020, while the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Columbia University found that U.S. companies lost at least $1.7 trillion in stock prices due to Chinese tariffs. U.S. corporations paid over $46 billion for tariffs, according to numerous studies. American corporations had to endure reduced profit margins, cut pay and jobs, defer wage raises or expansions, and raise prices for consumers and companies due to the tariffs. American Farm Bureau spokesperson: "Farmers have lost the vast majority of what was once a $24 billion market in China due to Chinese retaliation." The U.S. goods trade imbalance with China reached a record $419.2 billion in 2018. Due to decreasing trade flows, the trade deficit dropped to $345 billion in 2019, similar to 2016. Note that the U.S. trade deficit with China dropped, but not overall. Trump's unilateral tariffs on China shifted commerce from China, increasing the U.S. trade imbalance with Europe, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. China also suffered economically from the trade war, but not enough to comply with the Trump administration's structural change objectives. As the trade conflict continued, Beijing dropped tariffs on its other trading partners to diminish its dependence on U.S. markets. The final accord, unveiled on January 15, 2020, substantially matched Beijing's first offer: greater goods purchases and guarantees on intellectual property protection, currency, and forced technology transfer. The pact did not address subsidies, state-owned enterprises, or China's use of industrial strategy to favor its firms over foreign competitors. Outside the banking industry, market access progress was disappointing. Trump recently ruled out a Phase 2 agreement to address these and other issues. More room for Chinese aggression and oppression. President Trump wants a good relationship with China, particularly Xi Jinping, to advance trade negotiations. Trump publicly praised Xi's strength and leadership but avoided discussing serious bilateral issues in private. Instead, Trump allegedly used his private conversations with Xi to pressure him to act on his goals, notably trade and North Korea. Trump reportedly assured Xi Jinping in a private phone call in June 2019 that the U.S. would not criticize China over Hong Kong during trade negotiations. The following month, Trump declared, "We're working on trade deals," and that Xi Jinping had handled the Hong Kong riots very responsibly. See what happens. In November, he said, "We have to stand with Hong Kong, but I'm also standing with President Xi." He tied the problem to trade discussions. He called Xi a friend of mine, he's an incredible guy, and called Hong Kong protests a complicating factor in trade discussions. In response to Laura Ingram's question about China's human rights issue, Trump stated, "I'm riding a fine line because we're making great trade deals." January 10, 2020. Then National Security Advisor John Bolton claimed that President Trump told Xi Jinping in a private discussion at the June 2019 G20 conference in Japan why he prioritized a trade deal over other issues with China. Bolton claims that Trump encouraged Xi to create camps to detain 1 million or more Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, stating it was the appropriate thing to do, and begged Xi Jinping to help him win the presidential election by buying more soybeans and wheat. Trump later tweeted that Bolton's book is a compilation of lies and made-up stories and rejected Bolton's Xinjiang assertions. At a campaign rally in Manchester, New Hampshire on February 10, 2020, Trump said, "Last month we signed a groundbreaking trade agreement with China that will defeat so many of our opponents." Vice President Mike Pence and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have also criticized China's repression at home and aggression abroad, but Beijing has not seen their statements as a substitute for presidential opprobrium. During this time, the Trump administration tightened export controls, improved investment screening, challenged Chinese technology companies, and weakened the Belt and Road Initiative. However, Xi Jinping's replies to other leaders' signals are important in Beijing's top-down Leninist structure. The U.S. and other nations cannot have two China policies, only one. Beijing listens to other leaders' signals. The Chinese leadership is solely responsible for its irresponsible nationalistic acts abroad and violent suppression at home. Beijing's faith in Trump's concentration on trade and his desire to avoid letting other concerns derail an agreement made its present course easier. President Trump kept reassuring Xi of his backing in the weeks after the Phase 1 trade accord. Trump frequently complimented Xi's response to COVID-19's rapid proliferation in China for weeks. Trump's tone didn't alter until the illness hit the U.S. Was the trade war worthwhile? At an elaborate signing ceremony at the White House, President Trump and Chinese Vice Premier, the 11th-ranked Chinese official, announced a truce in the trade war. The pact requires China to buy $200 billion more American goods over 2 years than in 2017, according to sources. The publicly available pact commits China to respect American intellectual property, stop coercive technology transfers, and stop using currency devaluation as a trade weapon. The enforcement mechanism allowed import duties if issues were not addressed. China's purchasing ambitions have darkened in the 6 months since the pact was signed. Bloomberg calculated that China had purchased 23% of its 2020 procurement target in the first half of 2020 based on Chinese Customs Administration statistics. COVID-19 trade flow difficulties contributed to this gap, but the agreement's impracticality from the outset caused most of it. At the Council on Foreign Relations, Brad W. Setzer and Dylan Yalber portrayed Phase 1 as China promising to buy $108 billion in U.S. goods this year, $60 billion more than in 2017. U.S. goods shipments to China are much below 2017 levels. Thus, Beijing compensated for the deal by promising a windfall in American commodity sales. President Trump may have accepted an IOU as a triumph. China's readiness to transform agreements into law and implement them will determine if the enforcement agreement's innovations succeed where others have not. However, as the COVID-19 pandemic has put the U.S. economy in its worst states since the Great Depression, The key question is whether those enforcement agreements were worth the billions of dollars lost in value, the hundreds of thousands of jobs lost, the stagnation of U.S. manufacturing, and the devastating effects of the trade war on American farmers. The Phase 1 deal and trade war hurt the U.S. economy and failed to address the structural imbalances in the U.S.-China economic relationship. This concludes today's video. Did you enjoy it? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more engaging and informative content.